Turn with me to page 234 in your textbook, and this chapter is called Contract Formation. Contract law enables private agreements to be legally enforceable. And this is kind of an interesting concept because a lot of the laws that we deal with when it comes to don't speed, don't drive while intoxicated, or this is how certain things work, this is how our government works, or different laws or different statutes. A lot of those are considered more of a public law, but contract is absolutely a type of private law because in contract law, you actually can create almost any kind of agreement that you want to create. You can be creative, you can be flexible, and it's between you and another person. And it's a type of law that you make. So as opposed to judge-made law, contract law for the most part is law that individuals can make. And you can contract for almost anything that is legal. Contract law provides flexibility in that you can agree to anything that is not illegal or against public policy. And we'll talk about maybe certain things that might be illegal or against public policy later, but generally, the sky's the limit when it comes to what you can contract for. Sources of contract law. Contract law comes mostly from the common law. The common law. Remember the common law that we get from England, that we inherited from England, that was made of judges, going around doing circuits, and the judges would write opinions, and then one judge would refer to what another judge wrote, and over time, this body of opinions became the law. And so we inherited that in the United States, and we have developed our own common law over the centuries. So that's one source of where a lot of the contract law comes from, what we understand and what we know about contract law. Another source is the Uniform Commercial Code, and that's abbreviated UCC. UCC. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the other chapters, the Uniform Commercial Code is not in and of itself the law. It's only the law if states have adopted it as the law. So there's this Uniform Commercial Code that these people, these academics got together and wrote. They said this would be a great model law for sale of goods. When you're purchasing things, we need something like that to help trade, to help business. So they wrote it. And then many of the states, actually all of the states have adopted some of it. But none of the states have adopted, say, 100% of the UCC. However, most of the states have adopted enough of it to where it's important to study because there are some similarities, some major similarities in the UCC. So that's another important source of contract law. And especially Article 2. Article 2 of the UCC specifies the law for sale of goods contracts. So depending on what type of contract you're dealing with will determine what source of law that you need to go to, whether common law controls or whether Article 2 of the UCC controls. So what are goods? Goods are tangible, movable items of personal property. Tangible, movable items. So things like books and computers and things you would buy at Best Buy, for instance, or between merchants. You're buying widgets from this merchant. You're buying boxes from this merchant. That you're talking about goods. The common law specifies the law for all other contracts. So examples of common law contracts would include service contracts, when you go get your hair cut, when you get your yard mowed, or when you go to the doctor. Service contracts would also include land sales contracts. When you're buying a piece of land and a house and real property, you're dealing with common law. Now, I know that it probably sounds simple. You're either dealing with sale of goods or you're dealing with a common law, but in reality, sometimes the truth gets muddled. Let me give you an example. A roofer. When you are paying someone to put a roof on your house, what are you buying? Are you buying goods or are you buying services? You're buying both, aren't you? You're buying goods because you're buying all of the shingles and everything else that it takes, and the nails, everything else that takes, the actual goods, the items that it takes to make your roof. But you're also buying the service. You're buying someone's time and a company's time to actually put the shingles on your house and to do all of that for you. And so sometimes you kind of have this mixture. And the law, in most states, it usually uses what's called a predominant factor test. Predominant factor. So when a customer is purchasing a roof, are they mainly purchasing the goods? Are they mainly purchasing the shingles, or are they mainly purchasing the service, which would be a common law case instead of UCC Article 2, as far as where the source of that law would go to and where you would go if you had a dispute. For the roofing example, courts have usually said that something like that would probably be more of a service contract, because that's primarily you're paying roofers. You're paying someone to roof your house, and the goods that they do were, although they're essential, they're kind of incidental to the service. And so most of the time, for some of these services like that, you would look to the common law if a dispute happened, as opposed to Article 2 of the UCC. Bilateral and unilateral contracts. Two different types of contracts. A bilateral contract involves a promise for promise exchange. Promise for promise. So I promise to pay you $1,000 if you promise to paint my house. So I am contracting not for someone to paint my house, not directly. I'm contracting for a promise from that person to paint my house in a bilateral agreement. Or think of a cell phone contract. I promise to pay the cell phone company a certain amount every month, and the cell phone company promises to provide service to me so that I can call people on my cell phone. So that's a bilateral agreement. It's a promise for a promise. That's compared to a unilateral contract. That exists when a single promise is made to motivate an action. So let me give you the house painting example again. If I said, if you paint my house, I'll give you $1,000. Well, I'm not actually asking in that case for you to promise to paint my house. I'm saying, if you paint my house, so once you've painted my house, I'll give you $1,000. So that is a unilateral promise. Basically, in a unilateral promise, in a unilateral contract, the way that you accept that offer is through action. You accept it by painting my house. The first example for a bilateral contract, I promise to pay you $1,000 if you promise to paint my house. You accept that by promising to paint my house. Okay? And then if you don't paint my house, I can sue you. Or if I don't pay you, then you can sue me. Okay. Express and implied in fact contracts. Express contracts arise from discussions in which parties actually discuss the promised terms of their agreement. So everyone kind of knows the details. Usually the basic terms are how much is going to be paid and exactly what is the person going to get in return. So we'll go back to, I'm going to pay you $1,000 and you're going to paint, all of the exterior of my house, and you're going to paint it this particular color, and you're going to do it by this time frame. All of these maybe general terms that might be in a contract. That's an express contract. An implied in fact contract, implied in fact, arises from the conduct of the parties rather than words. As you know, when you go to the grocery store, when you go to a restaurant, when you go get a haircut, a lot of times you may not agree or talk about the price or talk about different things before you actually ask for the product. or ask for the service. You might go in and say, hey, I want to look like Tom Cruise. Give me a Tom Cruise haircut. And you sit down, they cut your hair, and then they say, okay, it'll be $20. So even though we didn't talk about the agreement before and all of the terms, as you would in an express contract, I still owe money because that was an implied in fact contract. It's implied. Everyone knows that when you go to a barber shop and you ask for a haircut, then the person's going to expect to get paid. Everyone knows that. Or another example is when you go see a doctor. And I think this is a very common example because, who knows how much it's going to cost when you go see a doctor? Who knows what the bill is going to be before you sit down? Number one, you may not know what's all going to be needed or what tests are going to be run, or especially true when you go to the hospital, right? You don't know till you get the bill, all of the things that they charge. You didn't agree to that beforehand, and yet it's an implied in fact contract. It's implied because you show up, you ask for a service, and it's implied that you're going to pay the going rate for that service. That's an implied in fact contract. Another distinction that we're going to cover is implied in law or quasi-contracts. Quasi-contracts arise when one party is unjustly enriched as a result of an agreement that fails to meet the technical requirements of a contract. And we're going to cover something later called statute of frauds, and that's something that requires certain contracts to be in writing. Like when you're selling land, that's supposed to be in writing, and there's other things there that have to be in writing. So sometimes a contract fails for one small reason, and if it's not a legal contract, sometimes one person might be unjustly enriched. They might have got a lot more money or a lot more service or something than another person. For instance, the book gave the example of what if you accidentally overpaid for a service or for products. Well, then that other party would be unjustly enriched if they didn't have to give it back. Another example would be, let's go back to the unilateral contract. Remember how I said, I will give you $1,000 if you paint my house. Or you could even say, upon painting my house. Okay? So what if you get up on my roof, you buy the paint, you buy a ladder, you do everything you're supposed to do. You spend a week, and you're painting my house, and you're almost done. You're almost done. You just have one small little section to go, and then I say, you know what? I changed my mind. I don't want my house painted that color. I want a different color. And you say, okay, well, give me my money. And I said, well, no, you didn't paint my house. You have to. The way you accept it is by painting my house. You didn't finish it. You didn't finish the deal. In that case, although there might have been a little bit of an issue with acceptance, court would apply this concept called quasi-contract. Because if they didn't, then I would be unjustly enriched. I would have an almost whole house painted for nothing, and that wouldn't be fair. And then you would be out all your time and money. And so that wouldn't be fair. And so courts sometimes will call something a quasi-contract to make sure that fairness is done and justice is done in certain incidents. An enforceable contract is an agreement that courts will enforce. Pretty easy, right? It's also called a valid contract. An unenforceable contract is an agreement that courts will not enforce, also called void contracts. An example of an unenforceable contract is a contract for something illegal. If you are angry at your neighbor and you go and hire a hitman and give the hitman some money to kill your neighbor and he doesn't do it, the courts are not going to enforce that contract because it's an illegal contract to begin with. So that's an unenforceable contract. It's also called a void contract. A voidable contract, that's avoidable, is an agreement where one party has the right to withdraw from the promise made without incurring any legal liability. So sometimes you might enter into an agreement, but if it's a voidable contract, then one of the parties can pull out. An example of that, and we're going to talk about this later, is when you're dealing with minors. If a minor goes to a car dealership, say they're 16 years old, and they go to a car dealership and they want the 2014 Mustang, and the person sells it to him, and then the minor a few weeks later says, I changed my mind, then that's a voidable contract because the minor could return it. Now, we'll talk about some of the specifics of that later, but that's one example of a voidable contract. Or let's say that someone lied to you to get you to sign an agreement. That's a voidable contract as well, because you could get out of that contract if you find out that someone lied. You may not want to, though, and that's why it's voidable. You could say, I know that person lied, but it actually is still a good deal for me, so I'm going to enforce the contract. It's voidable at your discretion if you're the person that's been lied to. So that's a voidable contract. An executed contract, executed, is one in which the parties have performed their promises. An executed contract. So this is the, let's go back to the original bilateral contract example that I gave you. I promised to pay you $1,000, and if you promise to paint my house. And so we both make the promises, and then you paint my house, do a good job, and then I pay you $1,000. So both sides have completed their obligations. So that's called an executed contract after both sides have completed their agreements. An executory, executory contract is one in which the parties have not yet performed their agreement. So maybe you're still painting the house. That contract is still an executory contract. Or maybe you finished painting the house, but I haven't paid you the $1,000. The contract is still an executory contract. So until it's completed, until both sides have completed their terms, the contract is an executory contract.